Welcome to Balkans Debrief. My name is Ilva Tare and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Euro 2024 ignited a firestorm as Serbia, Albania and Croatia faced off not just on the pitch, but in a tense display of simmering ethnic rivalries. This explosive mix proves once again that sports and politics are more than just teammates. Accusations of hate, chants and political stunts have even embroiled non-qualifying nations like Kosovo and North Macedonia. UEFA is caught in the crossfire, forced to face the ugly truth. Football and simmering political tensions are a dangerous cocktail, and not only in the Western Balkans, but especially in the Balkans. Joining us today is Florian Bieber, a renowned historian and professor at the University of Graz, specializing in inter-ethnic relations and nationalism in the Balkans. Florian, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ilva.
Welcome to Balkans Debrief. I'm sure you watched some games of Euro 2024 in the German soil. And I saw also that this intersection between sports and politics was highlighted. How does football act, if it does act, as a double-edged sword, fueling both rivalry and potentially unity in the region, in your view?
Well, I think why it can fuel rivalry is quite clear. It can be a moment when, nationalism comes out in force. This is nothing new. This has been a problem for decades in many ways. Football is, especially these European or World Cups, are moments when people identify with a particular state, a particular nation. And of course, if there are rivalries, it provides for a stage. That's what it is. It's a stage. Of course, many of the fans are organized, and in some of the countries, they are quite nationalist groups, which are also hijacking this issue. So this is, I think, why this is a source of rivalry. We also, of course, we see in many ways this football is a mirror of society at large. And so when we see displays of particular nationalism, it reflects larger societal tensions. But as you rightly say, it's also a moment of solidarity. So, there are moments when you can display support for each other's teams. And there were some of those shows before the games. Unfortunately, very often they were at the expense of a third party. So when Croatian and Albanian fans chanted anti-Serbian songs, or when Slovenian and Serbian fans sang anti-Albanian or anti-Kosovo slogans, that, of course, is not exactly a very helpful type of solidarity. But certainly we also have those moments of support for maybe somebody else. But unfortunately, the images we've seen in Germany have been more of rivalry rather than of solidarity.
Were you surprised by the nationalistic chants?
Well, I was surprised by the scale and the multiple incidents we've seen over the last week or so of the European Cup. We've seen this in previous games. There have been incidents. The Croatian team, there was a player who notoriously sang a song, a salute associated with World War II collaborationists. So we've had these incidents at previous games and so on. So, but what is surprising is the scale and the amount. But I think to some degree it reflects the way in which nationalism has, kind of reared its ugly head in recent years in the Balkans. Coming with a strong dose of historical revisionism in Serbia and the Republika Srpska, triggering again responses in the other countries. So, we see this kind of mutual reinforcing dynamics, unfortunately.
And I'm sure you might have followed the All Serbs gathering. That probably didn't help in fueling this nationalistic.
Absolutely.
narrative.
This of course occurred right in the middle, or right in the margins, or so to speak, before the European Cup. And of course, we've had months of tensions. We've had a lot of tension between Serbia and Kosovo. Going back to last year, the Banska incident, still not clarified. We've had a number of the very inflammatory statements by President Vučić, by Milorad Dodik, and other leaders. And of course, all of that is then reflected, given a stage at an event like the Football Cup.
Professor Bieber, how do national rhetorics in the Balkan countries shape the current narratives, and what can we do to change them, or what can the leaders do if they are willing to?
Well, the leaders, mostly unfortunately don't seem to be very interested in tuning down. I think a lot of it is top down. we have a problem in the region. The fact is that many young people are often more nationalist than their parents. They're often exposed to nationalist rhetoric from political leaders, taught relatively nationalist histories in schools, are given propaganda or at least nationalist narratives and stories in their media. And this, of course, leaves traces. I think the problem is that what has been neglected by outsiders, by the European Union and the US, is to just work with leaders, and sometimes forgetting that those leaders, might talk one talk to them in Washington or Brussels and promote a very different image to their fellow citizens within the country. And I think particularly Serbia is been a negative example of that. And there's been no recognition that, in fact, one has to also try to reach the citizens. The citizens in Serbia have turned away from the West to a very large degree because of the propaganda promoted by the regime. And that, again, leaves its traces. And that, again, triggers a negative reaction across the region. I think we're seeing the results of that in recent weeks.
Mm-hmm. Florian, do you have any data that support the fact that the youth have inherited this nationalistic approach from their parents? Because I was hoping to ask you if the younger generation actually can break the cycle of resentment, or they're destined to inherit past grievances.
I think nothing is destined, but unfortunately there was a survey a couple of years ago in Bosnia and Herzegovina among young people, and it shows that young people, those who did not experience the war, have a more nationalist attitude than their parents. But I don't think they inherited from their parents. I think they inherited from the media and the political context they're in. So I think it's not the parents to blame. Often the parents, they might have had nationalist positions during the war, but they also experienced war, and that, of course, left them often traumatized, but also, maybe a bit more reserved about this kind of easy nationalist narratives. So I think the problem is really that one has to break the cycle, or in fact, not let it get worse. But I think, unfortunately, we don't have a leadership. I mean, and again, there are differences across the region. I don't want to say that everybody is the same, but we have a trend where, unfortunately, the narratives from the state and the kind of dominant societal narratives worsen things. And of course, all of the nationalisms in the region are communicating vessels. If one turns more nationalist, it kind of triggers a reaction in the others. And so we see this also now in the European Cup, that again, one nationalist slogan, against Kosovo triggers anti-Serb slogans, and again, works its way up. And that of course is very problematic. So one has to really try to cut it. I mean, there have been initiatives like the Youth Council, which was established, RICO, at the Berlin process, but we need a lot more of those initiatives to change history teaching, to bring young people together. I think there are not enough initiatives and not enough spaces to really enable young people to discover one another, especially where there's a linguistic divide. So especially between, let's say, Albanian-speaking young people from Albania, from Kosovo, and those who are, speaking Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegrin, who otherwise are able to communicate with one another at greater ease.
So what can be done more for reconciliation? Apart from these initiatives, what else? Who can help? Are there any experiences from other regions that have addressed the issue and somehow we can apply it in the Balkans?
Well, there's no easy solution which can be copied. I mean, there have been attempts to, for example, have better school books made available. But of course, this only works if they're accepted by the countries, and they haven't been. There are very good textbooks which have been developed in the 2000s and 2010s by historians from the Western Balkans on controversial issues, and they are available. But again, the funding dried up. EU funding dried up for these kind of initiatives. The EU and the West focus too much on courts, believing that courts are the only way to deal with the past, but that's not enough. We need to really promote actively media, critical voices, NGOs, dialogue, and not dialogue which dodges the difficult issues. One has to talk about the war. One has to talk about the crimes. It's not about finger pointing, but it's in a certain way dealing with it. I think we're seeing a lot of not dealing with what happened. And all of the commemorations are basically about the other's responsibility in the wars. And this kind of lack of introspection, this lack of reflection really makes it very hard to start building bridges and to recognize, victims and to acknowledge that there were victims on all sides. It doesn't say they were equal. It doesn't say that, that all sides were equally responsible during the wars, but it's just to say that there were, Serb victims and Albanian victims. There were, Croat and Bosniak victims. So to kind of acknowledge the multiple victims and in a certain way find empathy and understanding. And there, I think a lot can be done, and a lot of support can be put in from outside. And of course, there are lessons to be learned from these dialogues across the European continent. But it's not a one-size-fits-all for the Western Balkans.
And I'm sure there is not a clear timeline when can this issue be addressed. It will take generations?
Yes, it's a continuous process. I mean, we see this also in Germany today, which is probably the country which has made substantial efforts, of course, also in line with the nature of the crimes perpetrated during World War II. But it's ongoing because, there's also forgetting, and forgetting is always a threat to historical memory in a critical way, and so it's an ongoing process. I think one shouldn't expect that this is something which is concluded ever. It has to be a continuous effort. But of course, once there is a foundation laid and once certain facts are accepted, then it's easier to build on that. And we haven't reached that, unfortunately. Denial, and in fact, denying is quite strong. If we look across many, Serbia, the graffitis glorifying Ratko Mladic, downplaying crimes. Unfortunately, all of that. So we're still at the level, or in fact, we return to a point where denial is stronger than remembering, the critical remembering. So unfortunately, there's a long way to go. And it will take a while. And one can hope that, of course, the young people have the position where they're not themselves burdened by those crimes. They are not responsible. They didn't commit those crimes. So it would be easier for them. But unfortunately, they're not getting the space right now. One can hope that some of them will rebel against their parents' generation and maybe the way in which they are kept locked in some of those stories. But one has also enabled them and give them information and give them a sense of that this is, doesn't deny them identifying as a member of a particular nation, but in fact, it's just kind of creating a more positive narrative about one's own nation and state.
And I agree. From denial to reconciliation, it will take a long time and efforts and willingness from all sides to reconcile. Croatia, an EU member, faces also accusations of racist chants, and UEFA is investigating. Does the EU membership offer any shield against deep-rooted nationalism, in your view?
Well, I think it's a contradictory picture. Of course, once you join the EU, the conditionality which might have required certain level of introspection ends. So it's easier after you join not to deal with those issues. I mean, before Croatia was forced to cooperate with the ICTY and investigate some of the issues related to the wars of the 90s. But once you're in, that's it. There's no more conditions. And so that puts a stop to some of those processes. Of course, you can say being in the EU provides for some kind of security. I mean, security not in a kind of just purely kind of sense of military security. Of course, that's more NATO, but a sense of identity security. You're in the club, so to speak. But it shows that it's still quite fragile, that sense of belonging to the European Union in Croatia. I mean, it had a record low turnout at the European Parliament elections. I mean, not to say that this is explained by nationalism, but I think it's a sense of not really feeling kind of fully identifying with the European project, and also with the idea that this is, kind of providing for some anchor which allows you to also critically reflect on your own national identity and the kind of maybe some of the dogmas which are part of that. And we have a government, for a long time now, which is, which comes from a kind of more conservative nationalist perspective, which does not really want to see a critical reflection of the 90s. This narrative of the war was just, and again, even if the war is just, doesn't mean that there weren't war crimes committed. And there's very little space for that kind of critical debate in Croatia. And so from that point of view, I think Croatia, unfortunately, is not a model for the other countries of the region to say you join the European Union and you critically reflect on nationalist myths, and also dealing more critically, for example, with the issue of collaboration during World War II. Again, these are big, not taboos, but these are issues which are not really dealt with in a critical enough fashion in Croatia.
Florian, do you believe that these ethnic tensions, nationalistic narratives will add more to the already existing skepticism from the EU members to accept the Western Balkan countries as full members or as new members, because full membership is still in discussion currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly is not helpful. I mean, listen, if you see, some of the chants, some of the shouts and slogans we've seen, many in the EU will say, well, it's a very different world than some of the other, kind of the Scottish fans, being in Germany seen as being kind of, very much beloved because of wearing kilts and kind of celebrating national identity in a very different way. The way in which many European teams are quite diverse in terms of their background. The teams in the region are much more homogenous. They're less diverse. There's also kind of racist attitudes. So, of course, I think there are people who will see this, who will say, well, do they really belong with these attitudes? So I think the fans who are shouting these slogans are certainly not doing their countries any favors. Not that they are thinking about that, but it makes the case harder. It's no doubt. I mean, if I'm trying to convince fellow EU citizens why the Western Balkans should be in, this doesn't help me give a good narrative. It makes it harder.
Among the list of problems or of issues,
of course, there are many other issues. This is not the highest.
Nationalism.
Of course, this is not the highest one. But people will say, "Well, aren't they nationalists? Don't they hate each other?" This is the kind of comments one gets in EU member states, and one has to counter that and has to say, "Well, no, it's more complicated. It's not like that. But of course, any slogan which gets transported in European living rooms in the millions and which shows hatred, is destroying the positive image which many people do have of the Western Balkans.
Any recipe how to address this?
I mean, again, I think football is actually a great terrain to have a positive image, and a certain way that many of the clubs or many of the teams are great teams and they play great football. So I think one opportunity is to really try to work with the national teams and the football clubs to try to understand that they are ambassadors of their countries and that they have to take it with greater responsibility and that they can do a lot of good. And, a young football player is such a role model for young people in their country. So if they are, if they're shouting nationalist slogan, they destroy a lot. But if they're sending positive messages, they can go a long way. So I think one has to work with these, young players as well to try to encourage them to have, a better, to promote a better image, not a nationalist, narrow-minded one, but one which, you can be proud of your country's successes, you can celebrate them, but don't express hate and don't exclude and denigrate others.
I fully agree. And these teams actually were with young, passionate, driven for excellence footballers that could have played a better role in addressing these issues. Although I agree, in terms of image, the region, except from these episodes, was quite important stage to show the existence of these dynamics. Thank you so much, Florian Bieber, for talking to Balkans Debrief.
Thank you, Ilva. Thank you for having me.